and we officially start. Hello everyone, I'm Naveed Fauzi, the Interim Director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies here at Bridgewater State University. I'd like to welcome my dear colleague and former colleague, current friend, Dr. Matthew Ray, who is based in Beirut, Matthew, and my current colleague, Dr. Sidita Kushi, who is teaching the second class that is joining this meeting. Well, we have joined two classes together for this talk. Dr. Kushi will introduce Dr. Ray, but let me take a couple of minutes. I am going to introduce our Middle East and North Africa program and promote a couple of events that we have, and we go from there. Let me share my screen with you and make sure that you see what I have here. First of all, the Middle East and North Africa studies this semester has a global scholar series that we are in this is the fourth event of the semester with Dr. Matthew Ray. As you see, all the informations are included here in this flyer. So any other events that you are interested in, you can go ahead and click on the Zoom link and register. And also, if you are interested to learn more, you can click on this link, go to our webpage, Middle East and North Africa webpage. All of the events are listed here, as you see, and you can click there and learn more about the event and the speaker. While I am here, let me also share with you the webpage for yet another program, Global Migration Studies program, that my colleagues, Dr. Kushi and Dr. Goshev, who is here, and Dr. Rachel Navarre, I guess she's going to join us later. We are developing this program. As you see, the event for today is cross-listed here because it covers both the Middle East and migration. The last thing is a flyer that I would like to share. The Global Migration Studies has developed an introductory course. It is INTD 233. My colleague, Dr. Rachel Navarre, will be teaching this course next semester in the fall, Tuesday, Thursdays, 9:30 to 10:45. This is an excellent course. Please, if you need a course that to fulfill these requirements, register for my colleague Dr. Navarre's course. Now I'm going to hand the podium to my colleague Dr. Kushi and stop sharing. She is going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Well, we are so glad to have Dr. Matthew Ray here with us as our guest speaker. He is the Director of Contemporary Studies at the French Institute of the Near East, and he is an Associate Professor at the Collège de France. He holds a PhD in history, and his research focuses on the political systems in Iraq and Syria as case studies to understand policy and state-building processes in the Middle East during the 1950s. He also examines the political engineering of power and intends to publish a book on the parliamentary systems in Iraq and Syria between 1946 and 1963. He was also a doctoral fellow at the IPFO in Damascus between 2009 and 2013, and a research fellow at the Middle East Institute in Singapore. He is also fluent in Arabic. And apart from this main research, he has given speeches and published articles on elections in the Middle East, development policies, the Cold War, and the Arab Spring. He is the author of Histoire de la Syrie, History of Syria, 19th to 21st century. And he will give a talk for us today called State and Society in Syria, Mobilities and Immobilities in the Modern Era. So thank you so much, Dr. Ray. We're very excited to hear your talk and to hopefully have a great discussion afterwards. And for our students, if you guys have any questions as our speaker goes through his topic and his talk, please feel free to add them to the chat, or you can hold off and ask them towards the end. We'll leave plenty of time.
Thank you very much for these invitations. I hope everybody can hear me well. And I'm very sorry if sometimes you will lose me in the course of the talk, because in Beirut, you know, we have a couple of problems in electricity, oil, money, currency, and so on and so forth. But we hope everything will be good for tonight. When we are thinking about Syria those days, there is many images coming directly in our minds. Cities were bombed, some kinds of slaughterings around the Islamic states, some ideas about sectarian groups which are not very well defined, massive flow of population spreading around the country. And all these images reflect some part of the modern history of Syria, but more precisely the last 10 years of this country. What I would like to look in details tonight with you is how this situation came out from an history of relations between the different social components of Syria and the Syrian state, or what we can call the Syrian state. Definitely, Syria is one of the major places if you want to understand the Middle East, as is encompass couples of sectarian groups or ethnic groups which are spread around the different countries all around. Those groups emanate from the long presence of the Ottoman Empire, which were the ruling power until the 20th century. Syria might be a case study in order to better understand how the Middle East went through a long process of what we can call the post-imperial age rather than a post-colonial age. And I will try to show you what is the difference between these two notions in the case of Syria. Definitely, there is different groups. If you are taking the Muslim population, you will find, of course, the two main groups, Sunni and Shia, but those two groups are also divided by other subgroups inside. Sunni can be divided by several different schools of thought. Shia, you will find some minority who pretend to be Shia, such as the Alawite, Ismaili, or the Druze. And those different components form the whole range of people who trust to be Muslim. On the other side, you've got more than one categories of Christians, and they were Jew until very recently, were spreading in the country. If we are considering the ethnical part of the country, you've got the Arab, the Kurds, and different other groups. In any cases, and that's what I will try to show, those identity are always one of the identity of the people, but they are not defining the people. It's depending on who is asking the questions about the identity and how the identity might be used or not on a political stage. The particular situation of Syria, such as also Iraq or Lebanon in some way, is that identity enter in the political realm in order to base or to fund part of the power of the regime who are ruling the states since the 70s. What we are witnessing since 2011, it's more or less a long crisis of a certain type of power that emerged in the country, who were ruled through post-imperial guidelines, and in which majority of the population tried to change the situations, but failed to build another kind of power. In order to understand that, I think we need, as it was done by revolutionary people in 2011, to go back at the very beginning of Syria when it became independent from Syria, from France, sorry, in 1946. At the end of the Second World War, the Syrian became independent due to the fact that the Society of Nations, who give power to France and Great Britain, collapse, and the mandate territories get their own independence through some struggles, but also through some kinds of recognition from the new United Nations. At that time, United Nations was enough powerful to give independence to some countries. At that period of time, the regime was a parliamentary system, meaning that liberal ideas and constitutions were ruling the country. Therefore, there is no link between, for example, the idea that Muslim country cannot host democracy or cannot be equivalent to Western powers. Problem is that during that, at the same time, a lot of different pressure came around how to build this liberal regime with the different components of the country. The main idea for the elite, and it will rule the country for at least the next 20 years, was that any people might be represented in the institutions from the point that they recognized the political center as the primary center to be loyal to. The notion of loyalty were very important. The idea of those elites was that the country need to be unified behind or under their supervisions and not to be divided. Why there was such a stress about divisions and splitting around was the fact that at the same time, several different territories of the Middle East became independent as a long process from the late period of the Ottoman Empire to become places in which some of the components, ethnics or sectarian, took control of the territories and claimed their independence. If we are going back a bit and to keep in mind what was in the memory of the elites, at the end of the 19th century, Christian population from the Balkan area get their independence from the Ottoman Empire, claiming to be people that is an independent body politics from the empire, because they can show up their sectarian bonds. Orthodox, for example, in Peloponnese, can turn to be a Greek people and get independence for the Greek. So there were a great fear about the idea that belonging to a sectarian minority or a sectarian majority, it was not the point of the debate, might be a way for some groups to territorialize their claim and to turn this territory into an independent state. When Syria became independent on the southern part of Syria, one of these territories turned into something which was one of the great fear for these elites. It was Israel, in which the Jew, which were components of all the Middle Eastern population, get their own independence. So one more time, minority or sectarian groups turn a sectarian bond into a political bond. Therefore, the dialogue between the center and the peripheries, mostly in Syria, was always part of the struggle about recognizing rights to the people, and part of the struggle was to recognize the center as the main leader actor on the territories. In 1946, the new president started to launch different enterprises in order to keep control over the peripheries, mostly in the northwestern part of Syria with the Alawite, and in southern part of Syria with the Druze. Those two groups are located in mountains. They're joined in the same areas, and they belong to some minorities from the Shia populations. While several elections were organized between 46 and 54, in many cases, when the candidate was not in favor of the group of the capital, the president or the government find a way to dismiss him or to push constraint against his elections. So in somehow, while the elite pretend to play the liberal rule of the game, at the same time, they dismiss the result that was not in their favor, meaning that they refuse leaders or they refuse candidates who push forward the idea of more autonomy for the regions. Any kinds of autonomy was perceived as a threat for the whole state, due to the other example that they've got in the mind. That was the first great source of tensions for the new Syrian country. The second source of tension came from the different layer of international struggle or international tension. At the very same time, when Syria became independent, the Middle East was the first places to enter into the Cold War. Turkey joined NATO, or what will become NATO soon. Greece also, and Iran was one of the main places where USSR and the Americans fought at the end of the Second World War in order to put their influence on. If you are looking to a map of the Middle East, Syria is the south country from Turkey. So for anybody, Syria was perceived as a place in which a battle to stop USSR might happen. If you control Turkey, you need to control also Syria, just to be sure that there will be not a reverse alliance between USSR and some Eastern countries. So this first layer happened in the Middle East, and all the development of the Cold War will deeply affected the political game between the different groups in the region. For example, if we are taking the alliance, or if we are taking the three major ideologies that was formed during the 1950s in the regions, all the groups, all the political Syrian groups will take part of it. Some of them will be in favor of the Western powers, belonging that the Western powers will help the country to develop. That is to say, to put technical assistance in order to get a better way of living. So it was mostly at that time some grants or some other financial supply in order to develop industries, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. For some other, the answer was to go towards the USSR as a way to counter what they perceive as the Western imperialisms. And on this vanguard, we find in 1950, the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, who were deeply in favor of USSR as a way to prove their anti-imperialism. In between, from 1950, as a consequence of the Korean War, a new trend emerged in the regions. It was about they defend the neutrality as a way to avoid the alliance between East or West. And this neutrality seems to be the answer of groups in order to promote Arabisms. If we are looking at the different identity, I mean the political identities, therefore we might find at this period of time 3 or 4 different ideas of how to define the national identity and therefore the national states. And that will be very important to understand how the different sectarian groups will act or not. On the one hand, there will be people who to defend the Arabisms. Arabisms mean that you put forward the idea that all Arab will share the same nations. Therefore, you are turning a linguistic idea, speaking Arabic, into a political identity all the people who are speaking Arabic are Arabs, so they should belong to the same nations. That was part of the political project of the Arab League, and some part of the different political groups put forward the ideas in Syria. That was mostly the idea for minority. So I will just precise a bit about who are the Alawites, the Druze or the Shia here. If you are considering the history of Islam, you have a main shift between first Shia, who believed that there were 12 different successors of the Prophet that you have to follow up. The other Muslims, the Sunni, will follow up the first, and then they believe that they were not anymore a caliph who was not to be recognized apart from the caliph that was ruling the empire. So they became the majority in Islam. In the 11th, 12th century, in the successions of the 12 different caliphs that the Shia were belonging in or believing in, some groups started to believe, for example, for the Alawite, that the 11th one was the true Mahdi, that is the equivalence of the Messiah coming back on earth. And they started to define themselves as the follower of this one. Progressively, they settled in the mountains, northwest part of Syria, and they started to develop some religious practices that defined them in between Sunni and Shia. So they were Muslim, but they did not belong to the majority of the Muslim. And this group is important for Syria. And you've got the same for the Ismaili or for the Druze, that is some deviances from the 11th century who settled in some communities and developed their own practices. Because from these groups that I will come back now on, came from the majority of the military officer. So as you see, after the independence, Syria was at the same time a liberal place, but a place of struggles, both internally and externally. Apart from the Cold War, the second layer of the tension came from the different Israeli and Arab war. In 1948, firstly, Syria fought with Israel, lost the war, and then in 1956 and 1967, they fought 3 different wars, and at the same time, they always lost the war. The same ideas was to promote the unity of all Arab countries, and they believe that their fight against imperialism mean that they have to fight against Israel. In this different layer of tensions and the different layer of the divisions, one key actors emerged during the 1950s. It was the army and mostly the officers. At the independence, the Syrian army might gather around 6,000 soldiers, which is nothing. It grew quickly in order to face what they call the Israeli threat, or to find a way to take the revenge from them. So it came from 6,000 to 50,000 around. At the same time, the group of the officers started to represent the true leader of the nations, as they were able to, on the one hand, develop the country. The military of the army was the symbol of modernity, was the symbol of order, was a symbol of the true characters to save and change the nations. And on the other hand, there were also the groups who has to prepare the country in order to fight outside. 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the leader of the Free Officer, took the power in Egypt, threw away the monarchy, and proved by social reforms and political reforms that he might recreate the nations. And that is very important for what will come afterwards. During the 50s and the 60s, the main ideas in the region was not to bring back dignity to the individual. It was not a civil rights movement there. It was a nation right movement. That is to say, colonial power encroached the sovereignty for many years. They put pressure on the region in several ways. So for the leaders, and mostly from the progressive parties, their main aim was to bring back the rights for the nation. That is to say, to share resources and wealth, not in order to build socialism, but to build wealth for the nation in order to develop the nation for all, and in order to prepare the nations to get its right position on the regional stage. From that movement to another, officers started to assume both a symbolic but a political role, very important. Syria started to be the place where coups were led at least every several years. In 1949, the three first coups happened, then 51, then 54, then 58, then 61, 63, 66, and finally 11, and that will be the end of this period of time. The coup is very important because during a coup, you have to trust your fellows. So you have to find a way to be sure that your fellows belong to the same groups. So progressively, what emerged during those different coups was that part of the officer who belonged to the same sectarian bonds, because they came from the same villages, started to unify in order to take the power. The first coup was a coup led by Kurdish officers. When they lost the power due to the second one, the Kurdish officer started to be pushed aside by the new team. So you see how the process started in Syria. And somehow, by bringing the officer into the play, it turned the ruler into sectarian drift and sectarian fights, not because of their primary identity, but because this primary identity was perceived by them as a way to get the trust from the people in order to make the second coup. At the late 50s, 55% of the officers belonged to the Alawites. This minority promotes a lot of people in the military academics because it was a way for them to improve their standard of living, while most of the activities, mostly liberal professions such as lawyers and stuff, belong to the people living in the cities, belonging to the liberal elites, and they progressively turn a struggle between two kinds of order. On the one hand, you had the elite from the independence who defend a liberal order that is a constitution, political rights and freedoms, but inequality and capitalisms, which put aside part of the population, mostly from the rural areas and from the different areas that did not belong to the city. On the other hand, you've got people coming from the rural areas, entering those academies, mostly for the military, because they find a place there, taking a position in favor of socialism or other kinds of Arabism, because it seemed for them that it was a way to improve the categories of all the people, that is minorities and the majorities who coming from the countrysides. So at the same time, you have a fight between, and this can be called the egalitarian order against the liberalist order. What happened at the late 60s was a great push from the rural areas in favor of immediate change, meaning that the people were requesting at the same time a rural reform in favor of sharing ownership in the countrysides, movement to develop the economy and to develop the capacities of those countrysides points or villages, to promote access to basic rights such as water and electricity, but also, and link it to push forward the idea of the whole nations as the body politics in which everybody can have a place, but have a place on the regional stage. And these tensions between the state and society undermine progressively and destroy totally the liberal order through the different coups. The different coups started to block the emergence of political parties at the beginning of the 60s, while one party, the Baath Party, took over the power, and that blocked everything because any coup to prevent another one to advance from advancing started to promote intelligence services as a way to be sure to stay in power. The paradox of Syria was that in the 70s, a group of officers started to rule the country through a new way or new rule of the games. And the ones who was assuming the power at that time was Hafez al-Assad, an Alawite, who emerged from three different coups, 63, 66, and 71, when he finally reached the top of the power and became the president. From 1970 until 2010, Syria will be ruled by one family, and it will change a bit, or it will change the way or the link between groups, I mean, mostly sectarian groups, the power, and the ordinary practices. On an official discourse, the Assad will always pretend to defend a secular idea of the state. On the ordinary life and ordinary practices, they will instrumentalize always the sectarian bonds. For example, you will always find some minister who will be Christians just because they are Christians. And then under the layer of the minister, you will find an Alawite who came from the same villages of some of the intelligence services officer who will refer directly to the president and have the full power. They will rigidify and they will create a kind of mosaic between the different sectarian bonds in Syria and blocking the people from assuming another identity rather than the sectarian identities. They started to turn that into practices in order to control the society. When you divide the people by forcing them to assume one identity, then you are able to divide all kinds of political groups, mostly your opponents. At the same time, Hafez al-Assad put in place, and his son inherited from him, the different intelligence services. There were 6 major branches of the political police or intelligence services who were ruling the countries, meaning that any service has the full right to control whatever he wants, mostly the different Syrians. That was what we call the famous joke in Syria, is that when you came out from a prison from one intelligence services, and the second one will arrest you just to be sure to know what question asked the first one. So basically it was a way to be sure and to control in depth the different components of the populations. All the officers from these intelligence services came from the same groups of village around the place of the presidents. So some of the people started to speak about a sectarian power in Syria, meaning that the Alawite controlled the state. But it was actually the opposite. The regime controlled the Alawites, and used the Alawite in order to control the society. But it was not a sectarian state. The Alawite remained in their majority the poorest part of the population in Syria until now. They were still deeply affected by the practices of power, but the minority of this minority reached the summit in power and put aside the other groups. By doing so, inside the Syrian society, the Assad regime built his regime and his practice on the idea that society might be dangerous, and the state, that is to say, this apparatus of intelligence services, have to prepare themselves to defend against any kind of threat or any kinds of oppositions. A new constitution was established in 1973, recognizing the president as a Muslim, and of course, Hafez al-Assad pretended to be Muslim at the time. And then very quickly after, turn different regional alliance in order to show that the Syrian regime was able to put troubles on the neighborhood countries if the neighborhood countries create problems inside Syria. It was mostly supporting Kurdish New Workers' Party from 1979 in Turkey, supporting sometimes Christians in the Lebanese war, then Palestinians, then Sunni militia in the Lebanese war, just to keep a control over Lebanon, above all the civil war, pushing in favor of opponents to Saddam Hussein, because they were a split between the Ba'ath Party, while Saddam Hussein belonged also to the Ba'ath Party. And progressively, Assad turned Syria as an actor who might undermine all kinds of stability around his country. At the same time, Syria entered in a deep crisis. Part of the Progressive Party who were in place during the 60s tried to contest the power in the 70s. And from 79, 76, several demonstrations restarted in Syria, mostly leading by groups in the cities. They contest the power and they mostly request the coming back of the constitutions, or at least some basic political rights, such as building political parties, building trade unions outside of the Ba'ath Party. The only answer was, from there up to now, repressions. But it grew slowly into some major fault at that times. First, it was against some little groups, and then from 1980 to 1982, the Syrian army was deployed in the major cities. You have fought in Aleppo, for example, or in Hama, and Hama turned to be one of the places who witnessed the major repressions from the Arab regime during this period of time. About 20 to 40,000 of people above a population globally was 60 were killed in February 1982. From that point on, for the Syrian population, the state was not an enemy, but was the most evil thing that was happening around their destiny. And they know that any kinds of opposition, political oppositions, might turn into problems. At that period of time, there were around 10 million of inhabitants in Syria. 20 years later, when the Hafez al-Assad president died, there were 20 million, so 10 million more. So for the great part of the young populations, they always lived under Assad regime, mostly the Hafez al-Assad regime. And they did not remember the long stories of liberties, constitution that was prevailing in Syria before that time. Inside the countries, the authoritarian regime from the father to the son, Hafez al-Assad to Bashar al-Assad, were more or less the same, keeping all the wealth through the ruling family, spreading around some clientele, and strengthening the power through the intelligence services who were controlling the country. But the difference between the father and the son is that the father has to rule with other important people or other important figures. All these figures went to power with him, mostly, for example, Ali Duba or Ali Haidar, who were the ruling people from the different intelligence services. And they were really important because each of them were able to gather about 30,000 men under their control. So they need at the same time to have part of the economy under their control in order to supply and to support their men. So they create some kinds of parallel clientele to the states. All of them belong to the Alawite, but they don't belong to the same level in the society. They create some alliance by bringing some marriage between their son and the son of the Sunni bourgeoisie, creating some nucleus in a new kinds of elites who share Alawites and Sunni. The Alawite provide the security or the political power, while the Sunni provide the economic power. And the greatest example of this alliance was Bashar al-Assad, who get married with a Sunni women from Homs, from a major family of these third cities of the countries. And she was the daughter of a doctor and just went out from a major consultancy society in London when they get married. Bashar al-Assad turned the Hafez al-Assad regime into new ones by developing neoliberal policy, mostly trying to gather as quick as possible the resources above a few. By doing so, and in a new regional stage in which there were pressure from the Americans, mostly after 2003, as they push Saddam Hussein out of Syria, and then from Lebanon after 2005, Syria started to be a place where this elite turned its control and its predatory activities above the Syrian populations more and more. Just to take an example, when we are looking at the southern part of the country, there is an area called Horan, based in which the capital is Deraa. This is the main area to produce barley and wheat in the country. It's more or less the equivalence of what you have in the United States in the Great Plain in between of the countries. So if you want to provide food for the population, you need this area to have major productions. What was happening from 2006 is that some part of the elites, mostly the brother-in-law of Bashar al-Assad, started to buy some lands, that is to say, to take some lands, to turn this land into touristic activities because it might provide a better plus-value to the elites. And this started to be the general rule in Syria. The two capitals will be preserved, Damascus and Aleppo, while all the different other areas, mostly the peripheries, started to be places in which the power might be practiced on a very intense level. There is all where there were all the resources were captured by a clientele belonging to the Assad. On the western part on the coast, in the Alawite country, or next to the Alawite country, the seaport belonged to the Assad families. In the southern part of the country, the agricultural place and capital turned into some other activities. Problem was that at the same time, a drought put pressure on the food markets in Syria. So at the same time, you have movement of population inside the country because they could not live anymore in the different peripheries, while the power refused to answer any kinds of economic claim from the populations. Moreover, they turn for their own profit some ordinary activities into some of profitable activities, even if it threatened the food supplies chain from the major cities. That was the situation at the late 2000s. On one hand, an incapacity to change the political order. On the other hand, more and more inequality in the economic activities in the countries. In 2011, some part of the population started to protest, mostly not at the beginning against Bashar al-Assad, but more or less to ask some change. That is to say, to request the end of the absolute power from the intelligence services around. Immediately, Bashar al-Assad turned his only answer with repressions. It started with beating the people, then using like level of weapons against them, then putting tanks in the cities, and so on and so forth. The major problem was that on the one hand, the Syrians components of the populations has to answer 3 or 4 major challenges at the same time. One was that to suggest a new political order under this unrest, how a new Syria might emerge after the revolutions. The second question was that how to represent all the components of the population, while part of the population does not want to define itself through some components. You remember that at this time, they have the memory of what was happening in Iraq after the American invasions. That is a constitution based mostly on sectarian bonds and the division of the population due to that. The third major aspect was how to change the economic course of the country in order to spread around the wealth for the people. And the fourth was how to find a practical way to dismiss this regime who was so deeply rooted in power. Months goes on, from 11 to 13, protests went through the country everywhere and started to militarize as a way to answer the 4 questions, while the 3 first remain unanswered. The main answer of most of the groups from the opposition was always that those answers will emerge after the victory. Part of the foreign partners always put pressure on the opposition to institutionalize, to find a way to guarantee their representativity and to guarantee the outcomes of the disorder. And that is one of the main problems in the time of revolutions. In the time of revolution, you make revolutions. You don't speak about institution. It's always coming after. At that time, I mean, French or the Americans just forgot their own history, during which French revolutions or American revolutions went through several years, and thereafter, some constitution emerged when the revolutions has won on the ground. In Syria, those things went not as if. The regime used several weapons to find a way to survive. First, it was a military or a coercive repressions, arresting the people, maybe around 1 million, putting them in jail, torturing them heavily, bombing the city, capturing the people, dividing them. That's the first one. The second one, which was more discreet and more erosive, was to play on the different sectarian identity. One very simple example to explain, to show you example. You are taking a taxi from one city to another. So you're about 6 people in the same car. you will arrive at a checkpoint. At the checkpoint, the people will check your identity card and they will loudly recognize you are Jews, so you're with us. You're a Christian, so you are with us. You're Sunni, and you will be arrested. By playing so, you push the people toward their primary identity. You push the people by saying that because you belong to this group, you have to act in this way. Naturally, in the prisons, all the members of the minority, Alawite Jews or Christians who were opponents, were moreover fought than the other ones because they represent the great in danger. They might show the lie of the regime. And the third way of fighting against the revolution was to bring the different foreign partners into the game. The Syrian regime immediately starts this by requesting Iran to support or to help supporting the repressions by providing basic knowledge about how to deal with some demonstrations and so on and so forth. And they then ask the Russians to enter into the country. When one part of the contest bring into the play some foreign partner, the other one has to find some help and to bring the other ones. So progressively, the Assad regime turned Syria into a stage in which everybody will fight against everybody. By developing a war against his own society and by developing a war against different components, they will force the opposition first to militarize and then to enter in the rule of the war. The first rule of the war is that you need equipments. If you don't have equipments, ask to the Ukrainian today, then you will lose the war. Progressively emerge some what we call national commander. So you have the French commander, the Qatari commander, the American commander, and so on and so forth, who were all the leaders of the military side of the oppositions who had the connections with one of the partner of the foreign partner in order to get access to some kinds of weapons. But there were clear divisions between the two sides of the fights. On the one hand, Syrian regime and its partner has always one rule and one only target: survival, and to do whatever it needs to survive. And until now, they were able to do so. That is to say, there were no project for the future. There were no ideas about changing the rule of the game. The only point was to preserve the regime on how it was working on. On the other side, the main questions from the different foreign partners about their support toward the oppositions, in plural, all the kinds of oppositions they were in favor of, was what will happen when they will win, never asking, but they might fail. And therefore, their support was always conditional and was until a certain level, which never helped a real balance of power between the two. And one more time, Ukraine nowadays showed what will happen when the regime used massively plane against the population. There were no missile against the plane. So of course, they were able to win more military battles rather than political battles. In these situations, two new actors play on the same game that the regime, that is to say, turning one ethnical or sectarian identity into a new kind of political bonds. On the one hand, the Islamic State proclaimed itself as the new state for the Muslim, the Sunni Muslim, and on the other hand, as a counter-answer, the Kurdish promote the ethnical ideas that they will represent the new regime in Syria. And those two groups need to be studied always in parallel because they were playing on the same level. the same ideas of one primary identity as the key aspect to build the state. Always play on the idea that they create a revolution in the revolutions. So they refuse to fight against Assad or the opponent because they will fight with everybody. Trying also to provide images that will strengthen support from elsewhere. When the Islamic State started to promote the idea of the caliphate in order to bring back some pre-modern rule in Syria, Kurdish promotes on the counter-side the idea of liberation of women. And on the two sides, you've got on one hand slavery market, and on the other hand, Kurdish women soldiers, more or less at the same weeks, showing that they've got propaganda responding one to another. Those two groups were able to bring what I call the first massive armed migration in the region. That is to say, French, Americans, Europeans, North Africans, Middle Eastern inhabitants moving from the countries in order to fight for something else in Syria. Paradox of Syria is that it started to turn into some stage in which the same population will be on the two sides, French fighting against the French, one in favor of Islamic States, other from the Kurdish or the regime, and you will find all those different actors fighting once against the other. As a result, part of the population in Syria started to flee. In 2012, the first group started to migrate on the neighborhoods in order to get protections. And one rule in the migrations, mostly speaking here for the migration studies, is that economic and political forced migrations cannot be defined as two different flows. It's always came together. At a certain stage, you have opportunity to move or not. And when somebody moves from one place, then the people will find a way to move there. For example, in Lebanon, the different components of the Syrian population who has moved to work in Lebanon during the 80s or 90s started to host the very first camp, which were illegal camp in the Bekaa Valley, even if this Bekaa Valley were under the control of Hezbollah, who was in favor of Assad regime. So people who are fleeing from the Assad regime took refuge in some areas who were under control of some ally from the Assad regime. Turkey hosts most of the groups of the population because Turkey offered a better deal for the migrants, as they were able at the beginning to work and to learn the languages. And progressively, they started to host between 2 or 3 million Syrians in their territories. This situation pushed Turkey to intervene more in Syria. The main idea of the Erdogan regime was to export the refugee problems. There were two main actors. One was the Westerners who had to pay that in order for Turkey to keep the migrants in Turkey, not for them to spread in Europe. And on the other hand, to put pressure on the different actors in Syria in order to create an areas in where those migrants might come back. Progressively, under the fight against Islamic State and Kurdish, Turkey took control of a part of the territory in Syria. At the same time, Russia was called by the Syrian regime to restore its own power, and progressively, Russia started to assume with Iran the full capacity control over the regime and the territories. Putin at that time was very happy to use and to train its military team in order to prepare an export. In that different components, that of what I've tried to show you in those different elements is that while it's able to for us to think about Syria as the places where the population is divided by different sectarian bounds or by different technical bounds, the major developments has to be linked into two different layers of ideas. The first is how you are playing identity into politics, mostly from the regime. How you can divide the population through that or build your own base. And the second layer is how you internal actors on the national stage bring external actors in order to strengthen their positions, and how these create some kind of chaos because you destroy your own sovereignty in order to survive at the expense of the majority of the populations who was just trying to get the basic political rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. I learned personally, I learned quite a lot, and there are lots of questions hovering in my head. But if everyone doesn't mind, I actually did get a question from one of my students earlier on in your talk, and I wonder if I may go ahead and pose that question on behalf of one of my students. Is that okay with everyone? So one of my students in our US foreign policy class, we just finished talking about the Cold War and US military interventions and regime change during the Cold War. We connected it to ongoing modern day parallels, possibly. And we also talked about the impact of international institutions. So earlier on in your talk, you were giving us a very strong rundown of the historical origins of some of these institutions and the role that Syrian identities played. The question that my student has is, you mentioned the UN is not powerful enough anymore to give independence to countries in the context of Syria. And they were curious, if not, why is that the case? What do you mean by that specifically?
When the United Nations was formed, there were a balance of power which was very clear. I mean, I'm speaking very of the two first year of the United Nations. At that time, USSR and USA were more or less able to agree on a common path and put pressure, of course, on the two other major players, France and Great Britain, because they were destroyed after the Second World War. And the fifth power at that time, China, who was the nationalist China of Chiang Kai-shek, was deeply in troubles inside the country, so he has no real voices. The history of the United Nations is that it progressively turned into places where the Security Council was not anymore able to rule, as there were an opposition between the US and USSR. That was one of the story. The other part of the story, and which is quite, quite important for those days, is that there is one cases in the history when two power who are represented in the Security Council were not able to block the processes. It was in 1956 when French and Great Britain intervened in Egypt. Then the two great powers turned into the General Assembly in order to build decisions that empower United Nations to act, even if one of the fifth of the power who are represented in the Security Council was not in favor of. And at the General Assembly was able to bring forward a majority against French and British troops has to stop until, and that's the first case in history since a long time. But at the same time, it was a combination between power in the United Nations and power above those two nations, putting a lot of pressure and sanctions against Britain and French during one winter, and they were able to stop the processes of this Egyptian war. And then progressively, the two different divisions between the General Assembly on one hand and the Security Council on the other hand were not able anymore to really implement a new kind of order or to defend the ideas of independence. And we witnessed that during all the 90s, when the United States started to be the great superpower as the USSR collapsed. in several different cases, the United Nations was not empowered to act in order to build a proper situation, Rwanda, Bosnia, and so on and so forth. And it was always American intervention that was able to turn the situation into something else. And as they were the Iraqi stage always, it creates some kinds of problems. And we can expand on that for a very long time, mostly because if you are looking at the 90s, most of the Russian leaders started to perceive the United Nations as the place through which the Americans were playing them fool. And if you do remember, during the 90s, the Russian representative was Sergei Lavrov, who was witnessing the different American intervention, mostly in Iraq, without the full agreement from the United Nations. And it creates some kinds of dissensions. So now on, we just turn in Syria in a new way of doing. That is to say, powers started to act as they want on the grounds, and they pretend in front of the United Nations. And the United Nations has no more power, but a voice. And even this voice is divided.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful clarification, and also very helpful, because our next lecture for our class is going to be the unipolar moment, US foreign policy in the 1990s. And you've already gotten us very well started on that dynamic. But please, if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask our speaker, please feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat. Naveed?
Yes, thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. I'm going to ask a question on behalf of my class to make it a little bit more about anthropology of religion. And when I focus on that specific ethnographic example that you shared, that asking people and their religion, their affiliations, repeating it and putting them in a category. And as far as I know, we use performance theory to analyze such situations, because you are demanding people to perform the way that you're asking them to be. I want you to talk a little bit more about these interactions, if you have more ethnographic examples talking about these ways in which these religious identities are reproduced and, as you put it, probably hardened and bolded.
I mean, there is two different layers we have to distinguish in those different societies. On the one hand, you've got what I will call the social performances. As in any society around the world, you belong to groups and you want to perform as the groups. So it will be sharing the same ideas of what are the religious feasts, what are the different places where you will meet and you will discuss. And those are the common grounds, mostly in the cities. Who is going to the mosque? Who is going to the church? Who are working around the church or the mosque? So you've got some neighborhoods which are in majority Christians or in majority Muslims. But it's not because you want to split the population between different groups, but it is just like basic social interactions from the everyday. You want to find your wife or your husband, so you need to belong to the same groups. And this is reinforced in the Syrian society or the Lebanese, by the way, because of a French rule of power during the Mandate period, saying that all the personal status belong to the religious authorities. So if you want to have, if you are born Christians, you will be a rule for your marriage, for your inerrancy by the Christian authorities. Same for the Muslim. So you will belong to those groups. That's one thing. When we are looking at the social performances, it's mostly in the privacy where you see that. It doesn't mean that you need, for example, to have a common economic bloc. You can share your activities with Muslim, Christians, or elsewhere. Then there is dissension due to the history of those different groups. For example, it will be more easy for an Alawite to get married to a Christians, because an Alawite was perceived by the Sunni as the people who were the farthest from their own religion, because they create a split in Islam. So they prefer somebody outside Islam rather than inside Islam. So during the 60s until very recently, a boy coming from an Alawite minority always have more difficulties to find a girl from Sunni backgrounds if it doesn't come from a major families. And in those very little details, different things will play. How do you speak Arabic? What kinds of intonation do you have? Can we hear the city or can we hear the countryside? Another white, because he was living in northwestern part, has his own dialect, or what we can call his dialect. He will say, for example, "Qalla" to say "I say," while a Syrian living in the city will say "Allah," because you just split the first. When you listen to different things, it will create some other behavior from the other sides. And all these performances was a way to recognize who belongs to who. And part of the story was during the fight for Aleppo in 2012, part of the Aleppine population will tell you that there were foreign fighters in their cities, while if you were listening to the people, it was people from the countryside, both Sunni or Alawite, by the way. So that is on the social aspect. But on the political aspect, it was another way to play of it. If you want to know who belonged to which group in Syria or Lebanon, because it's more or less the same here, you have two questions to ask. What is your name? That is your family name. And where do you come from? Which village? And then you know from linkages. We are speaking of some population, some groups who know each other. I mean, if I'm telling you, oh, you're from this neighborhood of, I don't know, New York, and your name is that, I will know definitely if you're Alawite, Druze, Christians, Orthodox, or elsewhere, just because of the history. And due to that, it was able to practice what I will call a frozen political mosaic. And the Assad regime always turned into putting some minority in some position without power, just in order to build a narrative saying that they integrate the populations. For example, you will listen to Bashar al-Assad saying he defends the minority, mostly the Christians, while if you are considering the Christian population in Syria, they rose in power during the 50s, never afterwards. They become once prime minister. And since the Assad regime came into power, most of them have to immigrate, not because they were Christian, but because they don't have any economic opportunities to a certain level, because they know that what I will call the iron summit or the glass above the head block them in their ascensions to power, both in economic realm or political realm. So that's the difference between the two. And it's always a play. I mean, it's not a linear mechanic way, but there are several layers to play on. And one of the layers, for example, when you don't give back power to the people, is to play on their identity and to bring one people from the lowest level of the population into a position of power, such as giving the people who are doing the bad jobs, torture, the greater power, while they're coming from this lower stratum of the society.
Many thanks. Thank you so much, Sidita.
So it looks like we are out of time and we don't want to keep our guest for longer than we've got him planned for. He's a very, very busy scholar. So unfortunately, I don't think we have enough time for additional questions. But this was extremely enlightening. I learned quite a lot, and I'm so grateful to have had you join our two classes this evening and this afternoon from our end of things. So thank you so much, Dr. Ray. We truly appreciate your limited time and that you're willing and able to share your insight with our classes today. Thank you.
Really welcome. It was a pleasure.
Big clap. And so for my class, I think we'll be moving on to another Zoom room. And I think, Naveed, you'll be staying in this room, correct?
Yes, we will take a 10 minutes break and we come back to this link. But my student, I want you to stay here. Don't leave yet. Thank you so much, Matthew. It was a pleasure. We'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the students of my U.S. Foreign Policy class, I have linked you to our Zoom room. It's in the chat, and we'll meet in the other Zoom room at about 3:20, okay? Do you guys all see that?
Click on the link because you're going to lose it, guys.
Yep, click on the link.
Open it.
All right. I'll see you guys in the other room at 3:20, and thank you once again to our speaker. Truly appreciate it, and it was wonderful to meet you virtually.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
I see that my students are still here, faithful. Good to see you guys. Let's take 10 minutes and we come back here and we talk Levi-Strauss. All right? See you soon at 3:20.